Hello everyone and welcome to the Induction Mentor Development Programme. This is module 2, and if you're watching the recording, we would very much like you to pause the recording to fill in the register, which is going to come up on the screen as a QR code. My name's Rebecca Roach and I work for the Central South Consortium, and I'm joined by Hannah Fancourt from EAS. We're presenting this recording this morning, but we're doing that on behalf of all of the different regions in Wales, so that all our mentors in Wales are getting the same consistent messages. So on the next slide here, we've got the QR code. So do fill that register in for us. It really helps us to know who's watched the recording and taken part in this training. So this session is all about exploring what is involved in being a reflective practitioner. First looking at yourself as a reflective practitioner, and then going on to look at how you can support your NQTs to become reflective practitioners. We'll also look at a mentoring and coaching approach to supporting the writing of PLEs. And as you'll be aware, the professional learning experiences are reflective documents. So that's why it's really important that the NQTs are able to be reflective and to take that reflection into their writing of those PLE documents. And then finally, we're going to consider how to equip ourselves for challenging conversations. This is really useful training because we all come across situations where we have to tackle something head on. And it's really useful to have some strategies in terms of how to deal with challenging conversations, particularly with our NQTs. So let's first think about the importance of reflection. As a career-long routine, we want our NQTs to be reflective, but in order to do that, I think it's really helpful for us to be modelling that reflective practice ourselves as mentors. So to start the session, we have got an article that we'd very much like you to have a look at. It has been posted in the National Induction Mentor team. So do go to the posts page, scroll up and look for that article, and you can download that and have a read. So if you haven't already read that, just pause the recording and have a little scan through that article. In the live session of this module, we did then put people into breakout rooms so they could have a discussion around the key points from that article, thinking about, what are the main messages about mentoring? What's the paper saying about different experiences from mentoring in different countries? Which of the papers listed might be of interest for you to read further into. So, we always like to link our training to research and what's going on. And this article looks at different countries and how they approach mentoring early career teachers. And some of the key messages that came out were that even though different countries have got different systems in place, that there are some real common features of mentoring, the importance of reflection, the importance of developing sort of, research informed practice and supporting our early career teachers, is such an important role. So after you've read that article, it may just get you to reflect on what you see as your role as the mentor. Definitely, we'd like you to be thinking about your role, making sense of, what you can offer the NQT in terms of support, having a discussion with yourself about, where your focus is in your mentoring. Think about those mentor meetings that you have. Is it all sort of focused around process, or is there sort of professional dialogue going on around, progression and how the NQT is developing? Think about, trying to work something out for yourself in terms of your vision for what you want your mentor role to be. Definitely learning from your experience. So if you've had previous NQTs, thinking about what you can learn from that previous experience about maybe what worked and what went well, but anything that you think, oh, if I have an NQT again, I'd do it differently. And therefore helping you to plan for the future in terms of supporting NQTs next year and beyond. And then asking yourself questions about, you know, what is effective in terms of mentoring, what works with my NQTs to really support them and help them to, you know, become the best versions of themselves that they can be. Asking questions around what could I do differently? You know, have I got the right focus in my meetings? Am I helping them to progress? Am I giving them the right support? So, you know, we would really encourage you just to take some time this morning as part of this session to reflect on your role as mentor. And then once you've done that for yourself and thought about how you can really model reflective practice for your NQT, what we've got to start to think about then is how we can encourage and support our NQTs to become reflective practitioners. And Morley suggests that there are 3 sort of levels of reflection that we might want to support. So as those come up onto the screen, we can just think about technical support. So how are we developing skills and competencies within our NQT? You know, are there specific things that they need to work on? And maybe that should be the development priorities then that they've got. You know, do they need to work on their Welsh language? And how can you as the mentor support them in that, or signpost them to different resources? Or maybe they need to work on their digital skills, and is that something that the school can support them on in upskilling in a particular area? So there's that technical level. Then we've got on a practical level, helping the NQT to understand themselves. And there are some quite nice diagnostic tools that you can use within coaching, such as a simple SWOT analysis, or a more complicated sort of social styles test, the David Merrill's social styles, or you may have used Myers-Briggs. There are lots of different types of tests out there, but sometimes something like that can be really a good way in to talk to the NQT about, you know, their self-awareness, their values, and that really helps us to get to know them. And as mentors, the more we know our NQTs, the better informed we can be to support them in the right way. And then we've got the critical level of reflection. So are we challenging? Are we sort of, you know, being critical with our NQTs in order to you know, help progress and improvement? So when we look at PLEs, are we just clicking that approve button, you know, without really considering, you know, challenging the NQTs on what they're writing? Are we having formal review meetings to really challenge them on their targets and the progress they're making? Are we having those tricky conversations, if needed, to make sure that we're not just letting things slip under the radar? And Hannah will go on to give you some strategies to support those difficult conversations if they're needed. So at this point in the session, we're just going to have a pause and think about where we should be at this point in the year. We don't want this session to be focused on process, but we did think it might be helpful just for you to think, if you've got an NQT who started in September and they've been full-time in your school, then by this point in January, February, we would expect certain things to have been done as part of the schedule for induction. So we do always suggest that around 6 PLEs per term is a good sort of guide. So, you know, has your NQT started their PLEs? Have they started uploading them? You know, are they on track with that? Have you done a lesson observation? So again, we would recommend that mentors are observing, you know, roughly once a term. I think it's really important for the NQTs that, you know, they are getting regular feedback from you to help them to make progress. So if you have been able to conduct a lesson observation, do upload that onto the profile. And then there are review points at 140 sessions, 270 and 380. So 140 sessions would have been around Christmas time, and we would therefore expect to see that first mentor review having been completed by this point. We would also expect you to have had contact with the external verifier. So, you know, do make sure that you're using them as a support mechanism and that you've had contact with them and maybe arranged a joint observation. Okay, so moving into part 2 of the session, we're going to focus on PLEs. And this section will help you to think as a mentor about how you can really support the NQTs to transfer that reflective practice into their PLE writing. I always get a little bit frustrated if I talk to NQTs and I'm getting the sense that they see the PLEs as a bit of a hoop to jump through or a, you know, a checklist to tick off. We really want them to see the PLEs as an opportunity to reflect on their practice. So that, you know, it's meaningful for them. So we've got a couple of little tasks that we're going to set you this morning. The first is a scenario. So this is your scenario that we'd like you to consider. You're mentoring an NQT who has met their targets, they've had 2 reviews completed, and they've had lesson observations uploaded. So, you know, it's sounding quite good, but they're really dragging their heels with completing the PLEs. They've still got 10 descriptors that haven't been mapped, and the PLEs that they have written have been quite brief, you know, not as reflective as you would like. So you may be thinking, oh, yes, you know, that's a situation that I've come across. Or even if you haven't, you might think, if I were to encounter that, what would I do? So we'd like you just to pause the recording and have a little think about that. When we were in the live session, we put people into breakout rooms and got them to have a really good professional discussion around that scenario and what would they do to support that NQT. So I don't know what you came up with as a sort of a strategy. This is one approach that you might take, and that would be to definitely arrange a meeting and to, you know, have an agenda item to discuss PLEs so that you're going to tackle the problem head on. The second step might be to actually sit down with the NQT and map out which descriptors they've got left so they can really clearly see which descriptors they need to focus on. I think it might be helpful to have a conversation around any barriers. So, you know, why are they dragging their heels with this PLE writing? Try and find out, you know, what is you know, the cause of this. Is it about lack of time? Is it about being unsure about, you know, what to write or how to write? Is it, you know, a technical issue with not knowing sort of how to upload them? So, you know, we need to find out what the issue is, don't we, really, in order to support them. And then, you know, what are the options to get around these barriers? So is it that you've got to do a bit of hand holding at this stage and actually sort of sit them down and arrange a time where you're going to have a joint meeting where you actually maybe write a PLE together and you know, you model one for them or you look at examples together and then from that you can then sort of, you know, set them some deadlines to maybe go away and write more PLEs by themselves. So it's about putting a structure in place, isn't it, to support that NQT. It's about finding out what the real issues are, so that you can support them effectively. So the second task we've got for you this morning is to think about that whole process of, how to support them with the writing of the PLEs, and then deciding whether you're going to approve or not approve. And this is the big question that we often get asked by mentors, that, particularly if you're new to the role, and people often ask us, how do I know if a PLE is good enough and how to approve it? So on the next slide, we've got lots of examples. These are playlists that we've created that have got about 5 or 6 examples in each one. And these can be found in the handbook, which you should have received this year. So if you haven't received a handbook, please do contact your regional lead and they'll be able to send it to you. And there's a page where these playlists sit and you can click on them digitally and go into those resources. But also these playlists are on the front page of the profile in the PLP. So when you open an NQT's profile, you can go to the Welcome tab, and you'll find these playlists in there as well. So plenty of examples on offer, and do take some time. You might want to pause the recording and actually have a look at these now. What these playlists do is to give you an example of a PLE, and you can see there are different ones specifically for secondary schools, primary schools, and NQTs working on short-term supply. And once you've read the PLE, you then click to the next slide, and what it shows you is whether it was approved or not and what feedback was given. So hopefully that will start to give you a really clear idea as a mentor then about what we're looking for and what makes a good PLE and therefore approved, or any areas in the ones that aren't approved, that need work. So do take some time to look at those examples. What we'd like you to have a think about is how to support that PLE writing. And again, in the live session, we put people into breakout rooms so that they could have a really good professional discussion around this. But if you're watching the recording, you could pause and consider these questions on the screen. So how does reading a PLE lead to a professional conversation with your NQT? So when you're having regular meetings, is talking about the PLEs part of those regular conversations? Do you look at them together? Do you discuss the feedback to support them? And we've got on the screen that spectrum of coaching and mentoring, from the sort of mentoring end, which is that directive approach down at the bottom there, where you're having to tell the NQT what to do, giving them clear instructions, giving them advice, offering them guidance. But you might feel that with some of your NQTs, you're able to push up more into that coaching spectrum up at the top there, where, you're just listening to what they're saying, maybe paraphrasing back to them what they've said, listening to understand the situation, and maybe, asking the right questions to allow them to actually come up with the solutions themselves, and decide, their next steps for themselves. And that can be really empowering to work with an NQT in that way, if it's the right thing to do, at that time. And obviously with different NQTs, you sometimes move between that coaching and mentoring approach depending on what is needed. Think about, how do you support the NQT to be reflective? If they're maybe writing a PLE that isn't very detailed, that isn't sort of talking about the impact they're having, it's about asking the right questions, isn't it, to sort of support them, maybe adding a bit of further detail in there. So definitely, thinking about the questions you ask can be really pivotal in those discussions to get the best out of your NQT. So I hope that that information so far has been useful. I'm going to hand over to Hannah now for part 3 of the session about reflective practice.
Thanks, Rebecca. So this next part, we're going to be thinking about you as the mentor, and we're going to think about that reflective practice and how you can support the process. So thinking about it from your point of view as a mentor, but also in terms of supporting your mentee, in this case, the NQT that you're working with. So what we need to think about when we're thinking about reflective practice is that experience first. So what experience are we having, or what are we doing? Then we think about the observation stage, and we are reviewing and reflecting on that experience that we have had or that the NQT has had. Moving into then that concluding or that learning phase. So from that experience, from the observation and the reflection on that experience, what have we learned? What can we take away from that, looking at the past events? And then we move into the future then, thinking about forwardness, thinking about what might we do to take that learning forward, and act upon perhaps some learning moving forward. So we're looking into that perspective, that active experimental stage in terms of trying things out to address perhaps some of the challenges or barriers that we found or observed. And then we go back to that experience. What does that experience look like now? Now we've changed something, or now we've asked those questions. And then the cycle will almost start again, and you'll look at the next steps that you could take. So when we're thinking about reflective practice, it can be broken down into sort of those 4 simple cyclical steps that we can take to support ourselves as mentors, but also the NQTs that we work with, perhaps when they're writing their PLEs or thinking about a lesson that's they've just had an observation on, or any part of their pedagogy for that matter. So as your role of mentor, it is a fact of life that sooner or later you'll find yourself in a situation, perhaps having reflected on something you've observed, or something that's been brought to your attention about one of your mentees, your NQTs, that you'll need to have a professional conversation. And this could be professional dialogue that perhaps you haven't had to have before, but it is a crucial leadership skill. It's something that will help you to develop in your role as a mentor. And what we're going to spend the next sort of few moments looking at, a few minutes exploring, is actually how you can do that and how we can support you and give you some strategies to think about those challenging professional conversations, think about why they're needed, and think about why they're really important to that NQT to be made aware of perhaps some of the barriers that they are facing and how they can overcome those, and what you can do as a mentor to support that. So we're not going to shy away from these conversations and hope that somebody else will pick them up. We're going to think about how we can take them on and how we can best support the NQTs that we work with. So when we're talking about challenging conversations, what do we mean? So it's a dialogue about a situation or something that needs to improve, and where you need to be able to manage the emotions of your NQT in a sensitive way. So think about addressing a progress concern, a conduct issue maybe. It could be tackling some personality clashes, dealing with potentially difficult, delicate conversations with parents. And, these conversations we're talking about here usually take place on a one-to-one basis. So they're you talking to your NQT as a mentor, having built up that trust that you can have this professional challenging conversation. And you know that it's needed in order to support that NQT to make the progress that they need to. So why are they necessary? Well, they're necessary, as you can see, for all of those examples that are on the slide. And, you can think about this is an opportunity for somebody to understand what the issue is and take steps to improve. So without having these conversations, you're almost depriving them of that opportunity. And by tackling this conversation, you are showing that trust and commitment to support them to overcome that obstacle. So a successful challenging conversation is centered around healthy conflict, and healthy conflict can help that NQT to improve by addressing the issues and being given feedback in a timely manner that helps them to improve and also makes your relationship as a mentor stronger rather than weaker. So if you think of almost those conflicts of being rocks, and every time one comes along, you pick it up, you put it in your rucksack, before too long, if you don't address those conflicts, going to really weigh you down. So as an NQT, if you're carrying these issues, or as a mentor, you're carrying these issues, they're going to become really heavy. So what we need to do is actually we need to start taking them out of the rucksack, talking about them, putting them down so they can be left behind and we can move on in a positive way. So we're lightening that load that's being carried both by us and as mentors and by the NQTs. So what we did when we did this as a live session was we did have a discussion task. So I'd like you to just pause and take a moment to think about how many difficult conversations have come your way. Have you addressed these conversations in a timely manner? And think about what was the outcome if you did address them, or if you didn't address stopped you? What was your barrier as a mentor in terms of having the conversation that you think you needed to have, but perhaps you didn't end up having with that NQT? And think about 3 reasons why we find these type of professional dialogues, these conversations, so challenging as mentors. So if you'd like to pause and have a think about those questions, and then we're going to provide some examples on the next slide. Okay, so why do we find these conversations so hard to hold with our NQTs? And we can see some sort of points on the slide there that you might have come up with yourself, and it's because we care, but we know we're going to say something that is potentially going to be upsetting to somebody, and we don't like the conflict, and sometimes we let the emotions get in the way of having this conversation. And difficult conversations with adults are difficult to the conversations we have with our children, with learners. And we would never shy away from a progress conversation with a learner if we knew that could really have a positive impact on the progress they were going to make. So the same should be true in terms of supporting our NQTs. What we need to be aware of is how we manage the conversation and turn it into a positive experience of support and feedback so we can move that issue forward and we can resolve it and we can help that NQT to make progress. And we're not always trained as mentors in the art of successful confrontation, if you like, in terms of having those professional dialogues. And the aim of this session now is to give you some tools that just might start you on thinking about how to approach these conversations. And perhaps a common myth is that if you have a difficult conversation, it's automatically going to lead to a concern over progress or possibly capability or a disciplinary procedure. And that isn't always the case. If these are had in timely manners, the idea of these conversations is supportive, is to provide feedback, and is to address any issues as they arrive before they get bigger. And hopefully then they can be supported to make the changes necessary and show progress before it reaches those formal levels. So thinking about then the excuses that you may have made if you haven't had these conversations, I'm sure we can all be guilty of perhaps thinking of some of these in our own practice. So we almost all at some point will avoid these, and it could be that we're delaying them, that we hope somebody else will pick up the conversation so it doesn't fall at our door, that we don't want to, disrupt the harmony that we have in our mentoring NQT relationship. And, we use these as just distractions and excuses from having that conversation. I don't want to hurt their feelings. And so I'm sure that somebody else will pick that up, or they'll notice it and they'll make the change. But actually, by doing this, all we are doing is delaying that conversation, delaying that feedback. And we need to start thinking about difficult conversations as a way in which feedback can be given. And we know that feedback can sit at the core of all great things. It helps us to see how we can improve. And it's an integral part of being a leader, being a mentor, is being able to give that really effective feedback that is clear, it's actionable, and it's a really difficult but really important skill to master. So we need to think about our mentoring role in terms of being able to give that feedback in a productive way. And there's 3 core components we need to think about now when we're thinking about structuring these conversations, how we build the trust and how we manage what is actually always an emotional issue that we need to address, because people will react in different ways to these conversations. So when you're structuring the conversation, you need to be really clear that your message is heard. So we don't want waffle. We need to be very clear about what the issue is. we need that emotional management around it. So emotions can be exhausting. They can often occupy too much of the thought about, oh, what if this happens or what if that happens? When actually really what the focus needs to be is on what the issue is and how we provide that clear feedback to move forward. And we need to think about the trust in this situation. So we need to make sure that the actions are taken following the conversation, and that there's trust there. And think about when we're having these conversations, where are we having them? What's the surrounding like? Is it conducive to having that positive conversation? What's our body language doing at this point? So it's not only about what we say, it's about how we present ourselves as mentors. How are we sitting? How are we open to having this conversation? So think about your non-verbal cues as well, as this can all increase the effectiveness of the conversation that we are going to have with our mentees. So here's one model that thinks about the potential reactions that you could get. So as a mentor, you've decided that now is the time to approach this professional dialogue. You've come across the issue and you're ready to have that conversation. Now, there are natural emotions that people go through, and they don't necessarily go through all of them or at any point in this order, but they are things that can happen as you have the conversation. And it's important to remember that everyone is going to respond slightly differently. And it's not personal. They're getting emotional about what's been raised. They're getting emotional about kind of perhaps hearing something for the first time. And that can be the first emotion, that shock. Someone's initial response could be shock or denial. And you might get things like, what? I don't understand. That can't be right, because they're trying to process the information that you're sharing with them. This can quickly sometimes turn to anger, and they realize that the feedback actually means that, it's got some potential implications, and they might react with, I didn't say that, or I didn't mean it in that way, and become a little bit defensive of their actions. And then what you might see then is that move to resistance, and actually they suddenly realize a change is needed. And as humans, change can be quite scary for us, and we can resist change in some instances. And that resistance may come across as things like, well, I've always done it that way, or it's never been an issue before. So that's a natural process that, the NQTs, your mentees, can go through in terms of trying to process the information in that conversation. And finally, what we hope to get to is that acceptance. They accept the feedback process has come to a point where we can now work on options for them to move forward. So we can think about what are the next steps and how can we put that support in to move forward. And I think the challenge for you as a mentor is to manage your own emotions in this process when being subjected to the strong emotions of others in some cases. Okay. So in terms of managing emotions, so this is a question that we often get, what do I do if my NQT reacts with the following emotions on the screen? And I think, there's no hard and fast rules about what you do here. And you need to be aware of the circumstances and aware of the environment. But if somebody cries, maybe stop talking, give them some space, pass them some tissues, let them cry. It's a natural response. It can be a natural response to a challenging conversation. It could be a release that you've actually recognized this issue that they have been carrying around with them. So it can be, a positive thing sometimes when they cry, and you just need to say, it's okay, we're going to work through this, but you choose that time when it's most appropriate. So we still need to have the conversation. When we have a break, we allow the emotions to settle, we pick it back up again. Somebody might go into fight or flight mode. They might actually walk out and think, they're fleeing from this conversation. And it's like a child letting them walk away, when they had that inappropriate reaction. At that point, obviously the meeting can't continue then. But when the emotions have been regulated, you want to bring it back to the purpose of the meeting, that it's about support. And we need to address the fact that it isn't acceptable to just walk out of the meeting. But I'd suggest this is done at a later date once those emotions have been regulated and they're back ready they've gone through that SARA model earlier, they're ready to come back and have the conversation. If they get angry again, this could be because it's actually brought that issue to life, it's made them realize. And again, it might be worth to postpone that meeting, but say we're still going to address this, but we're going to address it at a time when we are all in a better place to be able to have those conversations, the emotion has been regulated. And again, then at that later meeting, you might want to address the way in which they reacted, and go back to protocols around, being working together, the mentoring relationship. And if they don't say anything, this can feel really difficult as a mentor when you've given that feedback and you're met with silence. There's nothing coming back to you. And what I'd suggest is if there's a clock in the room, just watch that for just a moment, just a minute. Give them that time. If around 2 minutes you still haven't heard anything, you might want to say, would you like to share your thoughts? Encourage them to snap out of almost that freeze kind of emotion, but avoid filling the silence yourself. Give them time to think. They might want to go away and come back, have some longer thought time, but provide that time for your NQT or for your mentee. Now, another model that might support you in terms of having these conversations is the STORM model. And this is one that can be used when you've identified the issue and you know it's the right time and you now need to have that conversation. So starting a conversation badly is one of the easiest mistakes to make, and it's really hard to recover from. And it's the thing I think most mentors worry about. So it is advisable to prepare for your conversation. You might want to scribble down some notes, have a script. I wouldn't advise sitting there reading from the script, but in your preparation, you can have that as part of your preparation. You might have a trusted colleague that, without going into obviously personal details of your mentoring relationship, that you can just run by the issue to check that it is clear in what you are addressing. So always start with the issue. Start with, I've noticed, I feel, I've heard. This is often softer and less, you're not accusing then your mentee, your NQT. So you're not saying you did or you have access, but it lets them know what you're thinking and some facts then that you've come across. So state the issue, that has led you to having this conversation. And lastly, state what you want the outcome to be, the end result. And you want this to be a positive change and how you're hoping to achieve this with the person. And that's really important, this step, that you are taking them on board with you. So you're thinking about opening your sentences with, I've noticed, include some facts. You've been late 4 times over the last 2 weeks, and you need to be ready for work at 8:30 each day. So you're linking your opening sentence to a black and white rule that is, in difficult conversations, you need to have evidence to back up your issue. And you don't have the conversation until you're clear on what that issue is and what the evidence is. Preparation is key. So you've got that clear message. You want to go in being able to pinpoint the exact issue with the evidence, and then you are allowing them to provide options in terms of the solution, work on that resolution together with your NQT to make sure you can move on and you follow up then with any support that is required. So on the next slide here, we've got some examples of opening up conversations. And, you could use numbering. So on this number of occasions, I have noticed this has happened. Avoid the foggy words such as improve or better. What does that actually mean for your NQT? What does that look like? Clarity is key, so keep it simple. And then check your sentences with a trusted colleague. This comes into that preparation for you as a mentor to make sure you've got that clarity in what you're saying. And then really focus on the outcome. Focus on where you want to get them to. What point do they need to get to as an NQT? Because that's really the focus that we need to get to, as in terms of the mentoring and in terms of making sure that NQT has made progress. So remember, when you're having these conversations, maintain an adult approach, prepare your opening statement. Evidence is vital, and you need to build up that rapport. These conversations work best when you've already established that basis of trust in your mentoring relationship with your NQT. It's not about blame. The focus is on feedback and improvement, that end outcome that you want to get to. And acknowledge that emotional is inevitable, but embrace it. You have a model now to support you as a mentor and to support the NQT, and encourage that culture of feedback. So the NQT feels they have a voice and they are able to work towards that outcome following the conversation. So part 4 now is going to build on the reflective practice that we've already thought about and looking at how we can engage with reflective practice as a mentor to support us both in our role as mentors and linking to the conversation section we've just come from. So the purpose of reflective practice is to recognise and continue good practices, and we're thinking about the improvement that we can make. So we've identified something that's not working well that we would like to improve on. We can reflect on the small things. It's important that small things can have a really big impact. And you can find out more about yourself as a reflective practitioner and use your learning to support your NQTs. You can challenge practices that are taken for granted. So going back to that SARA model, but I've always done it like this. Why are we doing it like this? What's the rationale behind it? And you can monitor all aspects of practice on an ongoing basis by having that reflective tool to think about why we're doing things and what we're doing. And this will support innovation and change within the practice of the NQT, but also within your practice as a mentor. And remember, you don't have to work alone. There's lots of other trusted colleagues that you can turn to for advice and support with your mentoring role. So what does reflective practice look like? Some of us may think of it in the formalised sense of keeping a diary or a journal, or perhaps completing some mind maps, but actually it can be done in all different ways. It could be having a conversation with your senior leadership team. It might be in a journal for you. It might be built into team meetings. It might be just a thought process that you go through when you've got that couple of minutes to think about what's just happened and process that event. There's all sorts of ways in which reflective practice can look, and there is no right or wrong way to approach it. The important thing is you're building time into your schedule, which we know is very busy, juggling lots of things, but to be reflective and to think about your role as a mentor and your own professional practice to support the NQTs moving forward. So just in terms of reflection now, I'd like you to take a moment and to pause the recording and to think about, is there a skill that you would like to learn maybe, or that you would need to develop or refine moving forward? Is there an element of your practice you'd like to look at? Or what would you really like to change or improve in your practice? And this can be as a mentor or as a class teacher, a practitioner, a leader, but just take a moment using some of the tools we just thought about to have a think about what your next steps may be. Now you've identified that element that you'd like to reflect on. And just the final slide we're going to leave you with is just this picture here, and there's a link that you can click on if you'd like to watch it. And the important thing is it's not actually the experience that we learn from, but it's the reflection we have about that experience that impacts our next steps, our outcomes, and our actions following that experience. So we need to do that reflection in order to make sure we are moving on as mentors and we're able to support our NQTs to move on by reflecting on their experiences to date. Okay, so that is the end of this recorded session. Please do take the time to fill in the evaluation form before you end the recording. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and we hope that it has supported you in your role as a mentor supporting NQTs across Wales.